In November of 2021, Simpleflips uploaded the first part of his playthrough of this game, and I must have watched like 30 seconds before immediately deciding that I had to play this unspoiled. I stalled on it for several months because I assumed I'd have to buy it, but it turned out that it was in the itch.io bundle in support of Ukraine, so I actually already had it for quite a while before ever realizing. By the time I noticed, it wasn't prominent enough in my mind to bother right away, so I put it on the back burner for however long it would need to take. 13 months later, I lost internet for a week, and since I already had it downloaded, fuck it, so I played it. I want to offer a thorough spoiler warning to this video. Obviously it contains full spoilers for Hypnagogia Boundless Dreams, but it also spoils parts of Co-Open, Where Am I, Antechamber, Awoni. Being an exploratory game, merely seeing any part of Co-Open is a potential big spoiler. It's all about wandering around and finding things yourself in a pleasant space, so knowing what to expect on any front is, I think, a disservice to playing the game without that knowledge. As such, even though I show little of Co-Open, I would recommend playing it if you're interested and able before watching. Alongside Hypnagogia itself, Co-Open is available from the Itch Ukraine bundle, so you may already have the game. It's only a few hours long even if you're decently thorough, and it's one of my favorite games, so I very much encourage people to play it if they can. Technically I show Super Monkey Ball at one point, but I consider that game's core mechanics and ideas unspoilable. I only show a bonus stage, and even then it's one that a new player would see within like 10 minutes of playing for the first time. I don't consider this a spoiler of any sort, hence leaving it out of the list earlier, but I'm obliged to mention it. Where Am I is an old Game Jam horror game made by the Slender the 8 Pages guy. It's a tiny game, and so while I only allude to it and show a few seconds of gameplay, that's still enough to effectively spoil most of it. Antechamber spoilers are limited to a random clip of basic gameplay from early on, and it mostly just spoils how the game's core premise functions in practice. I only show a single room and puzzle of Awoni, though not the solution to it. It's from very early in the game, and I don't believe it spoils anything meaningful at all, except for roughly identifying the genre that the game belongs to. Also, I'm sorry for my pronunciation of it. I have appropriate links to these in the description. Do with this what you will. Hypnagogia Boundless Dreams begins with a cutscene setting up its premise. I'll show that in full. Some kind of glowing being then tells the player that their arrival has been anticipated for considerable time, and that they must dream. They're then promptly sent to the tutorial area, nowhere in control of the dreamer. This is a fucking phenomenal first impression. The vibes of the menu, opening cutscene, nowhere, and the dream nexus are wonderful. There's no way I even saw Simpleflips get to the tutorial, and I had actually forgotten whatever scraps I knew about this game beyond the presence of a bunny guy, so I was a little surprised that it ended up being first person. Speaking of, the bunny guy in question is named Goji, though that typically isn't learned for quite some time. Besides control info, little of importance is told to the player in Nowhere. It's quite pretty though, and nicely short. Upon exiting it, the dreamer is confronted by Hypno in the Dream Nexus, and she claims to be its guardian. The Dream Crystal, which maintains the health of the dreamscape, has shattered, and so the dreamer must go to various dreams to retrieve its shards. While the crystal is shattered, dreams will actively succumb more and more to chaos and negative thought. Thus, the player is instructed to head to their first dream, Cave World. Yeah, for some reason the game refers to them with simple descriptors like that in the Dream Hub, so I'll generally be using those instead of chapter names like Help a Friend here. Based on my memory only really including Goji and the particular familiarity I feel at this shot where he's on the little Dream Nexus platforms, I think I must have stopped the video right about there, assuming Hypnagogia was a vibey third-person platformer where you play as the rabbit dude. Arriving in Cave World and exploring around a little bit, then, was something of a disappointment. My expectations being shifted and shattered was a prominent part of my first playthrough of this game, and this is the first instance where that happened in any impactful way. In fact, overall, this video is going to present the order of events and some thoughts and thought processes I had as they happened in that initial playthrough, as the way it all went down at the time is key to my experience with and resulting opinion of the game. In playing Cave World, it became apparent that it was rather akin to Co-Open's gameplay. You walk around, talk to people, and do the things that they tell you to do. Co-Open, as mentioned in the spoiler warning section, is an exploratory game. It's all about finding cool things in the comfortable space you're plopped into and talking to cool people. Its premise lends itself to a subdued, childish sense of wonder in a mundane, low-stakes, and cozy environment. Lopal has prioritized a sense of discovery for players. Though the game is ostensibly about just buying things in a store, that's not the real focus. There are discoveries to be made and, most of all, people to meet and help. Co-Open exhibits such an exuberant and infectious reverence for people. Lopalists goddamn fucking love people, and that shines through incredibly clearly in their beautiful little game. The amount of care and personality injected into Varogda's inhabitants is absolutely amazing, bonus points for most of them being really gay, and so simply traversing its world becomes enjoyable despite how often the player is made to backtrack. I adore the goobers in and around this little shop, so when I've got to do some boring menial task for them, I end up wanting to. I want to know more about who they are and how they'll react and feel when I help them out. In this way, Co-Open excels at a focused atmosphere and artistic objective. The mundane wonderment of a child in a new situation, wherein they meet various pleasant people and, most likely, go out of their way to perform acts of kindness. Hypnagogia, on the other hoof, does not emphasize exploration. Traversing its worlds is enjoyable, certainly. I quite liked seeing what they held and what happens in them, and both games are very pretty in their own right too. However, it lacks the exploratory nature of Co-Open. Boundless Dreams is a pretty linear game. The player goes to a place, talks to people to figure out what to do, and then does that task. There is discovery in there, it's just not the same as Co-Open. Moreover, the writing in this game is not nearly as well done, or at least as charming, as Co-Open's. A good portion of the NPCs earlier on, though less so later, this actually gets less pervasive with time, feel almost obligatory. There'll be a trope played straight, or a single bit of dialogue that's transparently really throwaway, and it feels kind of empty when it happens. Granted, this game was made in 8 months predominantly by one person, and features a dozen or so levels which each required unique assets, most of which also needed unique characters. Co-Open was predominantly made by 2 people and is considerably less ambitious. It has only one world, not too dissimilar to the size of some of Hypnagogia's individual levels, with one set of characters. It had also been in development in some form by April of 2020, which, given its June 2021 release, means it had 6 months longer to be made at minimum. Thus, I fully understand why the writing here came out as it did, and why the exploration feels comparatively dull for much of the game. And on that latter point, well, I can't even claim that as any kind of criticism. It's clearly not what the game's going for. It's understandable that it came out as it did, but that doesn't mean it's much less distracting how underbaked the NPCs can feel. Let me say, though, that I find the overarching characters of Hypno and this glowy guy avoid this problem, likely because they're not one-offs that the player is intended to talk to once or twice and mostly serve as set dressing. Comparisons to co-open and the general throwawayness aside, the writing still feels iffy. Particularly, it's mentioned that Cave World was written to contain commentary on bad working conditions and the like. I interpreted it completely in the wrong way, which I think speaks to its effectiveness as commentary. It came across to me more like the boss character Fran was exaggerated as a jobs, am I right? kind of joke, whereas the upset workers were merely upset because they had a bad mindset about their work. Quote, "I don't have any other skills, so it's my only option," unquote, sounded kinda like the dev stating that merely having more skills alone would create lucrative job opportunities. And the portrayal of Lazy Gib read as a poorly attempted satire on leftists whose principles are perceived as being a front for laziness. It's not limited to Cave World either. Mistworld, the next one, feels the need to offer bizarrely preachy advice that I interpreted in a similarly centrist or right-leaning way. Water God Althos telling the dreamer that lots of obstacles one faces are merely a construct of their mind that they can overcome if they just want to harder. And Red Seer Ramus, sorry about that pronunciation, gives their red pill speech about how you have to rise above all the betas by being dominant or whatever. These are deliberately played up in uncharitable readings now that I have a more informed perspective on the game, and to be completely clear, these are not indicative of the developer's intent. Nevertheless, these were sincerely the vibes it gave me when I first read this stuff. This advice isn't even necessarily wrong or bad, it's just very interpretable in a poor light. Anyway, that's all I have to say for Cave World. It's okay overall. A good introduction to the meat of the game, but a disappointment for my expectations. I already showed Mistworld and, well, I hope others feel as I do about its visuals. The graphics in this game are always constructed in a brilliant manner, and I think this level shows that far better than Cave World did. I really like the art style all around, and the dev seems to have a great eye and skill for 3D modeling. I'm not exactly particularly knowledgeable about this sort of thing, so I have trouble analyzing anything specific here, but the visuals are consistently super well done throughout this entire game. Of particular note are the reflections, which are used a decent amount throughout the game and aren't static reflection maps. Or, well, a good portion of them aren't, but some still are. And those are fine and have their place too. But I really like the look of these dynamic reflections, and what's especially noteworthy is that they aren't screen space reflections either. For those unaware, screen space reflections take the already rendered screen and then apply some transformations to it to create the impression of a reflection, without having to render an entirely new viewpoint. In this instance, you can see the Dream Hub's entirety reflected in this orb, despite none of it being in my natural field of view. It also shows the moving particles and objects in motion, suggesting that it isn't merely a still image being projected onto the sphere to resemble a reflection, which is what a reflection map is. I really appreciate seeing these. Super Monkey Ball on the GameCube used them, and I always found them very pretty there. And gosh, what a delightful vibe this world has all around. The water serpent design is really silly and endearing, and all these weird structures look so cool. I have trouble finding the words without being redundant. It's all just fantastic. The water as well, lying about everywhere, adds a lot to the aesthetic. There's also this whirlpool which is supposedly intended to be imposing, but personally I just found it neat and immediately tried jumping into it. Hypno mentioned there being secrets after all, so this seemed a good spot to check. The mood of everything, including the writing, is a massive step up from Cave World as far as my tastes go. Mistworld is more or less exactly the kind of thing I was wishing for when I started playing Boundless Dreams, and so it gave me the impression that perhaps Cave World was an outlier, Maybe this was the kind of direction that the game would continue to go in from now on. That prospect excited me greatly, as although Mistworld is actually even more sparse on gameplay and writing than Cave World, it had nonetheless presented me with one of my favorite video game environments to memory. I like the characterization of all the serpents except for the Red Seer. As mentioned earlier, the advice felt as though it was clunky and preachy, even if they've got a point of sorts, and in such a comfy space I didn't much enjoy the confrontational attitude that they had. But otherwise, they're all just little dudes. Kind and welcoming and doing their little things in their beautiful little world. So immensely serene and idyllic. Mistworld's objective is to reform the Dream Shard by having Water God Althos merge vials of sacred green and red water, which the respectively colored seers keep watch over. Upon doing this, the whirlpool coughs up a red haze and turns a concerning crimson. You couldn't pay me to refrain from immediately jumping back in. And that's how you access the second secret world in the game. I missed Cave World's secret on my initial playthrough, so the one I started with was Underwater World, fittingly titled A Deep Unease. It's an immediate and wonderful contrast to Mistworld, and absolutely pretty in its own right. The title and visual juxtaposition prompts the player, or at least prompted me, to feel a subtle dread at whatever's coming, and the game appropriately builds that dread up for a while in the exterior section. The soft but droning ambient music aids a lot in setting the tone as well. Though it's not necessarily intimidating in isolation, it takes on a matching tone to its surrounding elements and intensifies the player's anticipation. The look of the temple from this path is great. The spires and otherwise low profile look super neat to me. I completely tuned out this green orb while recording this part, to be honest, but I'm a tad conflicted on it. I don't think it really needed to be here, as the restrictive terrain and sights seem like more than enough to guide the player over to this little pool to talk to the cephalopod. Speaking of, the warning offered by them worked on me. Or, well, it did emotionally, but I didn't know I could just leave this place and return straight to the end of Mistworld, and they're damn right that I have misguided curiosity, so I continued. It already felt like the wrong thing to do, though. The ambient music and the look of the place, and even the fact that I ended up here through the whirlpool secret, all served as evidence of their assertion that I should not be here. I was right to take it that way, too. The dreamer continues on by picking up these colored cubes and placing them down elsewhere. I'd call this an elegant tutorial if this were a mechanic that one could fail, but its usage later is pretty much identical, and I think players would be able to learn it there without prior knowledge just fine. If that were the only role that this played, I'd say it should have been cut, but it actually contributes quite strongly to the aforementioned warning as well. This doesn't feel like something you should be doing. Here you are messing with these weird cubes and statues you don't understand at all in this imposing and unexplained dimension. I truly did feel like an interloper, meddling where I shouldn't with things beyond my knowledge. At the end of this section, the dreamer takes this alien diving gear and descends past this grate into the underwater temple below. And I didn't do that. Not again for this recording. I'll make it abundantly clear why in due time, and no, it's not because I'm innately afraid of underwater exploration. I was actually totally fine with it in that regard. Slightly spooky, sure, but fine. I'm gonna use footage from someone else for this part, who I'll credit during editing because I can't yet know who it is. From here, it was miserable. Gameplay-wise, it's fairly tedious, but not particularly difficult or frustrating. It just takes a while to traverse back and forth, which happens a lot. The first thing the player is allowed to do is enter a big hallway that leads to these statues, the middle one with a terrified expression of some sort. The surrounding ones will eventually hold their respective colored cubes, and until then they function as buttons to temporarily open respectively colored doors. There's also a very heavy-duty door in front of the statues with what looks like a depiction of a shark's jaw molded into it. The door emits loud but distant and muffled banging, as though a large creature is attempting to escape captivity from further within the temple. Instantly, this conveys what's going on. Obviously, there is a big, evil, destructive beast in there that's sealed away. I took the yellow door first, by coincidence, which leads to a team of researchers who are checking out this weird ancient temple evidently made by some extinct species. There's this big spinning monument neolith, which is sort of just there and doesn't really get explained, but that's not very important. One of the researchers is looking at a little mural and says, "Wow, there sure is a lot of stuff about this Edax creature that's associated with mass destruction, smile. I sure do wonder what that's about." And again, obviously that door leads to a murderous fucking sea monster. It was plainly self-evident the moment I saw it, and it hadn't exactly gotten less clear-cut with that NPC. So you get the yellow cube from that room, and you can hand it to the statue that opened the yellow door in the first place. Nothing happens immediately, but you've already been through this. Both cubes are required to activate this mechanism. So you head through the red door where a big friendly eel named Eden resides. She's super kind and pleasant, and I quite liked talking to her. A few characters have little quirks in how they speak like this, and I find them pretty charming when they come up, particularly Eden's. She also just kind of allows the player to grab the other cube from a chest that she could have simply chosen not to open. She gives a half-hearted non-attempt to deter you from doing anything with it, like, "You'd best stay close to the surface of this here temple, pal. Wouldn't want to see the horrors deeper in, smile. But also here's the key to do exactly that, haha, be on your best behavior now." Figuring there's nothing else the game would let me do, and in spite of the knowledge that it would inevitably lead me to inflicting death or something otherwise horrible upon these people, particularly Eden because she actually has a compelling character, I took the cube and returned it to its statue. And, of course, the menacing beast enclosure opens. Further in, there are monuments to lost cephalopods from when they were sealing Edax away, inscriptions upon them noting their causes of death at the hands of Edax. Edax herself awaits just beyond this point, and she asks the dreamer to help her by giving her food. Mechanically speaking, as far as I know, there's no choice but to go bait the research team and Eden to go after Edax and get devoured. I called this miserable because fuck, man, I was just forcibly made to betray an eel and get her killed after she had only showed me kindness because that's just how the scenario progresses. I knew the whole time that I was just dooming her and everyone else, and it was legitimately fucking grueling to follow through on it. Hypnagogia didn't even have the decency to be subtle about it. It hammered it in far too much for me to have not known what I was doing. Maybe if that door was the only hint, it would have been better, but there was no plausible deniability whatsoever. It even spells it out slightly clearer if the player returns to the mural guy. I was truly hoping that when Eden went over to try and protect the player from Edax, she would actually succeed, that it wouldn't go such a tragic direction. But it did. She gets eaten, and so do the researchers, and so does the dreamer. It made me feel genuinely remorseful. Underwater World ends inside of Edax's stomach, wherein an ancient cephalopod is eternally kept alive to serve as Edax's sole company. The player then tells him that no, I'm not here to replace you and free you of this torment. I'm actually here to defy your singular other wish of not waking Edax up at this moment by collapsing a pillar so that I can nab this funny MacGuffin that I need. On Underwater World, the developer writes, "It's more or less an inversion of Mistworld, pitting you against a feeling of dread, confusion, and misguided trust." As of writing, I interpret this as referring to the misguided trust that the research team and Eden place in the dreamer. I hope the developer wasn't that blind to how heavy-handed the foreshadowing here is. However, I did not interpret it this way while initially playing the game. I read it as saying that I, the player, had placed misguided trust in Edax and was manipulated into freeing her. And under that lens, I just knowingly got someone incredibly nice killed. I liked them and wished they could live the entire time I was in the process of betraying them by enacting their murder. And I'm having someone empathetically pat me on the back, earnestly saying, "It's not your fault. You couldn't have known," despite paradoxically being the reason I was so hyper-aware of what I was doing in the first place. What the fuck? After that emotional nightmare comes Mushroom World. It's just like funny Mario with the mushroom guys and the mushroom platforms. Again, I don't believe, or at least don't wish to believe, that this is the intended takeaway from Underwater World. But the emotions that my presumed misunderstanding brought about made the whole thing even worse for me. I've been uncharacteristically CinemaSins-esque about the writing here, taking the piss out of how obvious everything is, but that's because all of this stuff had contributed heavily to how morally reprehensible I felt for enacting this whole thing. I wrote most of this section the night I finished the game, where the emotions were a lot more raw, and while I think it's a tad uncomfortably abrasive now, I figure it's best to leave that tone in because I think it conveys far better how much this affected me than a sanitized version ever could. This was emotionally the absolute lowest that the game dragged me while playing, and immediately after it all happened, I kept thinking to myself that maybe if I had gone and told Eden before meeting Edax, or just in a different way, I could have saved her, and maybe if I answered differently to the researchers, then I actually could have just left with them. It prompted denial, in other words. I strongly considered replaying it to try those things, but access to Mistworld is closed off after collecting the Dream Shard. I wasn't able to return until after finishing the game, by which point I had no desire to actually try these things out. I doubt they would have worked anyway. Underwater World was a reality check for me. I thought the game might continue in the direction Mistworld had taken, and under that perspective I could have never guessed that the game could ever pull something like Underwater World. But after? I couldn't hold any expectations anymore. There was effectively no boundary the game couldn't cross if it was willing to do that. I resigned myself to the possibility that any fucked up thing could happen, yet held hope that the rest wouldn't delve into the kind of thing that Underwater World embodied. It was just a secret level after all. Surely the main ones would stay safe, so to speak. So, Mushroom World. It's fun enough. It has an absolutely stellar skybox and atmosphere. The visuals are truly amazing in this one. The views of these mushroom platforms. This little cliff. The mayor's hideout. The temple. While the vibe of its world isn't quite my kind of thing in several small ways, it's a very comfortable and pleasant space to inhabit, especially so after the existential horror I've just been through. I actually find that Mushroom World looks better than Mistworld. It certainly has a beat in variety. I only really prefer Mistworld because its surrealist style is more appealing to me than the exaggerated and dense nature of Mushroom World. Plus the village and dialogue aren't much to my tastes. Hypnagogia excels at conveying a vividness within the worlds it presents, for better and worse. Of all the levels, Cave World felt the most detached and void of context, distinctly closed off and artificial. Except for Space and School World later, all of the others feel fleshed out and vibrant enough to be intuitively believable. Of these, Mistworld is perhaps the most sparse in its world building and sense of place, and I still have no trouble imagining that there's more to it than what the player sees. I would never argue that this is anything but an artistic strength. Having places that feel real in some sense is an unquestionably good thing as long as that's the goal. So when I say for better and worse, I mean solely in my experience. And in that regard, well, Underwater World, Ice World, Desert World, Candy World, Gateway to Heaven, and Tower of Heaven are made manifestly worse for me. I'm mentioning this rather early because it's a constant quality throughout almost the entire game, so I'm refraining from showing any of those yet unmentioned levels for now. Had these worlds been less immersive and convincing, my feelings about this game, good and bad, may not have been so strong. For some reason, I have a particular fondness for silly, flirtatious scenarios. It's really fun to me to pretend flirt about some stupid, cute joke thing. So the weird door here, minus how this one bit of dialogue feels like it mashes together a few tropes with little regard for the context of the situation, is a highlight of the game for me. I don't really have anything to say about it, it's just a gay little dude. You love to see it. Upon returning to the Dream Nexus, Hypno is perched on a pillar and staring at the dreamer. The last couple times she took a minute to speak to them and foreshadow a bit, but this time she opts to say nothing. These sections aren't worth commenting on for a while, so that's why I've been neglecting them. The game takes a turn here. Excluding Underwater World, which was easily the darkest experience in all of Hypnagogia for me personally, the game's been fairly lighthearted up to this point. That changes now. The developer commentary for Iceworld states that Boundless Dreams was intended to be rather lighthearted overall, but on creating Iceworld they decided to instead make the game more and more bleak as it continues. Presumably this is a large part of the reason why the game's plot is what it is. The thing that keeps dreams stable and nice has shattered, so they gradually descend into horrific spaces of decay and despair. I can only guess that Underwater World was made after this decision, because holy fuck, that would be a massive outlier otherwise. Iceworld's premise is that there's a race of little guys who had a civilization not too dissimilar from that of real Earth, but at some point it began snowing, and never stopped, and the temperatures were impossibly, terribly cold. There are few survivors, and a good portion of those are borderline freezing to death. As a whole, they can barely survive at all. It's incredibly bleak all of a sudden, compared to the prior main worlds where, at worst, it would portray serious problems like the shitty treatment of workers in a tongue-in-cheek manner. The player is tasked with running around the frozen, snowed-over, buried remains of a dead civilization, finding the scraps of its populace clinging to life. For those not far from losing that battle, the dreamer can give them a hug, a show of kindness that lights a fire nearby to keep them warm, and prevent them from freezing to death quite yet. To actually beat this world, you have to find a ghost and do a little quest to get its dog back. Iceworld is just really fucking sad, dude. I don't like being there at all. It's absolutely dismal. It's not bad, I don't think anything in this game is except for maybe the clumsy commentary, but goddamn did I not feel okay playing this game at times. All except 2 worlds from here on out, including secret ones, left me feeling upset for one reason or another, which likely says a lot about me. This is far from the only emotionally affecting piece of art I've come across and disliked. Often, whenever art elicits a strong feeling besides comfort or something otherwise pleasant, I'll think about it a lot. I'll reflect on how it made me feel, and maybe I'll be compelled to tell a friend. This is almost never a positive experience, instead being taxing and upsetting the majority of the time, and so stuff like this, like Iceworld and Underwater World, ends up sucking for me despite how good they are. One Shot, which I'm not even going to show footage of, did this for me as well, albeit a lot more severely. While I loved a lot about that game while playing it, I hate it. I don't know that I'm ever going to return to it, and frankly, I doubt I could reasonably handle it for the foreseeable future. Hypnagogia was not that bad for me, but it's still one of the worst instances of this. I'm overly sensitive to this kind of thing, likely because broadly I've encountered so little media that anything emotionally resonant is still somewhat foreign a concept for my brain. And that sucks, because it means I can only appreciate Boundless Dreams or other similarly impactful art begrudgingly and from a distance. The developer commentary for this level also states that the dialogue was supposed to convey the idea that Iceworld's residents are emotionally detached and cynical about the world and other people, which, I don't know, I guess Wanderer Reese arguably exhibits that? Homeless Mo is kind of an asshole, maybe him? Bailey mentions people not really visiting, so maybe it's that others are distant from them? To put it another way, I don't think this goal is accomplished. The characters here generally read to me as rather kind and welcoming. They don't seem cold and distant towards the world and other people as the commentary claims is the idea. As for feeling that way about the world, I think that part is fully justified in this case, and otherwise they seem like a pretty personable little community to me. Joe even gathers all of them, except Reese, to behold his fish cube. Minus the kids who are too busy having a snowball fight, which, fair enough, I guess, they're kids. I didn't actually find Desert World until after my initial playthrough, but I'd like to speak about it briefly here anyway. It's the only world besides Underwater World that I refuse to do again to record it. Which sucks, because it's really cool in a lot of ways. The boxed-in dunes are a cool locale, and it comes across to me as though it's a less dire situation than an ice world, even if it's still not exactly the most livable climate out there. You even get to ride these strider things. That whole aspect of it was quite a bit of fun for me, being able to go so fast and jump around so high. Unfortunately though, it's a prequel to Ice World, and it's not a slice of life thing, there's a specific event here. The player is forced to be the one to cause Ice World's fate, which elicited yet more guilt when I did it, even if only a little. Without that, this may be one of my favorite worlds in the game, but that was another emotional hit that I genuinely didn't expect and don't want to return to. At least, the developer commentary suggests that it's a prequel, I think. To be honest, time-locked parallel world is indecipherable to me in determining whether it's supposed to be a distinct but parallel world or the same world earlier in its timeline. I interpreted it as the former when I played through the thing, but this mentions that the dreamer's meddling in Desert World causes a paradox with the origin of Ice World's snow, so unclear wording here. Regardless, it fucking sucked to inflict that kind of thing on Desert World's inhabitants, and then to return to Ice World and find that it's gone sand mode too, and nobody is there anymore except for the ghost. Desert World and Ice World together create a more depressing impression than either do on their own, and so I'm actually quite glad that I missed it on my initial playthrough. Thankfully, Space World doesn't keep up the trend of making me feel horrid. Instead, it's got cool visuals, a neat setting, weird NPCs and writing that I find pretty unremarkable, and a jetpack mechanic which is actually far more fun to try to cut corners with than I anticipated. I have almost nothing to say about it beyond acknowledging my appreciation for it as an emotional breather. Also this visual effect with these big glass circles, that's really neat. This does serve as a good time to note that this game uses the setting of dreams in a way that I find slightly peculiar. I mentioned during Mushroom World's section that the developer does a great job in making these levels feel like plausible worlds, in an artistic sense anyway, and that's a tad strange, isn't it? It is to me, at least. My perception of dreams is far more on the fleeting and illogical or inexplicable side. They're brief glimpses into worlds or experiences which may be nonsensical and/or impossible. Hypnagogia's dreams are fairly grounded and don't feel fleeting in the slightest. They feel like places that have histories and futures outside of the dreamer's visit to each of them. Space World, alongside School World, is one of two exceptions to that, being a place that doesn't really have any explanation or context, and where things just happen for a few minutes and stop. What even is Space World? I have no idea, and that feels more in line with what dreams are than any of the others. Even Cave World feels like a continuous place, it's just that it feels so narrow a vignette that it only includes context for what's immediately relevant, and thus feels a bit half-baked and unlike the others. Or School World later is also quite akin to Space World, but that one's a secret, and it's truly the only other example I'd call similar. After the dreamer jumps into a black hole, there's a small intermission stage called the Ethereal Crux. In it, the player controls Goji, the intro cutscene bunny guy. I really enjoy the glimpses that the player is given of the wider dreamscape through stuff like this and Nowhere, the tutorial area. There's always really cool art direction in them, including the Dream Nexus. Well, there's cool art direction pretty much everywhere in this game, but these ones have a distinct style of sorts that I'm a fan of. I liked the music here quite a bit too, which is something I haven't commented on much, but that's largely because I can muster little more than "it's good" or "it just serves to remind me of an upsetting part of the game," depending on the track. At the end of the Ethereal Crux, Goji gets captured and seemingly imprisoned by a sleep paralysis demon. This might not seem to make sense given a certain occurrence earlier, but let me go on a quick tangent. The Ethereal Crux has a mirror which, upon interacting with it, says the following. Quote, "A reflection of what you believe to be you. But is it really you? What lies on the other side? Parallel worlds and parallel timelines, one a reality, the other a nightmare. Face your true self." Unquote. I think this is rather literal. Goji was captured initially in the intro cutscene of the game, and the Ethereal Crux is the place he ended up at. I had a lot of trouble trying to make sense of why the Metal Gear Solid thing in the corner was there, but under this reading, it's literally trying to tell the player that this is a dream that Goji is in. Then a sleep paralysis demon, likely the true form of Hypno, invaded the dream and put him in a stasis that's alluded to much later. One a reality, the other a nightmare is just like, dude's in a nightmare, you know? That's my best guess, but it is by no means concrete. Hypno has a hat now. It's a peculiar detail, and the only explanation I can think up feels like a reach and may have some holes in it. I'll offer it regardless. I see the hat as an attempt to feel more guarded. If Hypno truly is this sleep paralysis demon, the one who attacked Goji this second time, and assuming that the Crux happens in parallel to the dreamer's journey, then just before the two meet again in the Nexus, Hypno is coming back from a confrontation with the real guardian of the dreamscape to lie some more to the dreamer. Hypno, real name Grimthorn, could feasibly feel insecure at this moment. She doesn't want her lies to be seen through, but she already did something pretty ambitious with regards to her goals of taking over the dreamscape. So she subtly hides herself behind a big hat as she interacts with the dreamer. It could cover a physical injury too, but either way, feeling less seen could bring comfort in a dishonest, manipulative scenario like this after something particularly intense. On the topic of these characters, I would like to state explicitly that Goji is given almost no context within this game, and I essentially had no idea what he was supposed to be at all until the ending cutscene. Same for this glob of bloom from the intro, who I'm pretty sure is also supposed to be the thing talking to the dreamer after the black hole incident. Same for Grimthorn. The sleep paralysis demons are generally self-explanatory, but those three key characters in this story were simply not explained up to this point, and even when they are explained later, it's only just barely. Boundless Dreams is technically a sequel to a game titled just Hypnagogia, so perhaps this stuff is explained in that game. I wouldn't know as of writing because I don't have the internet access required to download it. During her dialogue back in the Dream Nexus, Grimthorn mentions a surge of power, which is evidence for the Crux being a parallel event rather than a past one. If you were a scary evil demon guy and you trapped the good virtuous bunny guy in a crystal, you'd probably gain more influence over the dreamscape too. Haunted World starts with the player at one end of a fairly lengthy path in the woods. There are lampposts and benches, everything's covered in a relatively thick fog. It's unnerving, yet somehow cozy. Rain, little spooky breathy noises, and the player's footsteps are the only sounds besides the crunching of leaves or twigs in the forest every so often. The path leads to a small graveyard in front of a mansion, divided into halves by this deathly green liquid with some platforms through the center. On the right is this gravedigger, Grady, along with an assortment of graves. On the left, just an assortment of graves. I wanted to look around the spot some more before proceeding, as I tend to play new games in a somewhat completionist manner where applicable. So after talking to him on the right, I went to the left side and, oh, what do you know? There's a grave with a hole under it. Better jump in. Dropping into School World was brilliant. The immediate vibe of being in a dreamlike, empty school with a ton of snow outside. I love that. A lot. And, of course, it's a secret world accessed from Haunted World, so that one's on pause. Unlike Underwater World, which was accessed at the end of Mist World, School World is placed such that the player has effectively not even started Haunted World by the time they enter. I'm not sure what I expected of School World from its first impression, but I didn't anticipate a little horror experience. I probably should have, but I didn't. The soundscapes presented within it are exceptionally executed. The noises at the very start next to the windows and doors sounds vaguely as though a harsh wind is assaulting the building's walls, albeit slightly off. Once the player interacts with the bulletin board, it begins to play more of those breath-like sounds, lower and more prominent than in Haunted World. Each time the player attempts to open a door, it gives a short knob jiggle. The subtle and ever-present hum of fluorescent lights is present as well, and the game forgoes the regular footsteps for a more grounded, appropriate variant. The vibe and the lack of any life make it so that a flashlight falling softly down some steps is enough to startle the player far more than they otherwise would be. Not in the way a jump scare would, rather because such a noise is a lot more noticeable and implicitly concerning under these circumstances. Which, as an aside, the animation for this is synced up very well. That must have taken an annoying amount of effort for such a tiny detail, when it could have just played the noise once and most likely wouldn't bat an eye. Generally, that ability to use one-off sounds to draw the player's attention or startle them is taken advantage of quite effectively. I've barely played, watched, or read any horror-y things, so I don't have much of a frame of reference, and perhaps this game's execution is bog standard, but it worked really nicely for me. It wasn't too scary or oppressive, there are no jump scares either, but it maintained its tension well and asked me to enter dark hallways blind a surprising amount. And I did it, not with too much hesitance, but absolutely while thinking, I'd really rather not do that. Although in a manner that was playing along with the game's expectations and smiling at its attempts to toy with me, more so than genuinely wanting to stay away. This also isn't the first time the game changes its text box style to suit a given world, but I really like how it looks here. I can't fact-check this, hence the uncertain language, but I'm pretty sure Silent Hill displays text in a very similar way, and that's a stated inspiration in a few spots, so I figure it's borrowed from there. An element of School World's design that I'm pretty neutral on is the way it alters space while the player isn't looking. It's not something that really freaks me out, perhaps that's due to my exposure to Where Am I and Antechamber, both of which heavily utilize this sort of thing in, I think, more effective ways. I like School World's usage of it as a way to prevent aimless wandering in the wrong direction, I suppose. It nicely streamlines things, and maybe it adds some unease for certain players. I enjoyed the idea of thinning out this final hallway as the player proceeds, and pushing the destination further away as they're presumably walking forward. That there's a light at the end of a tunnel to end this level at all feels kinda random, but it works fine. I quite liked School World, largely because it's a non sequitur and a disembodied fantastical environment. It makes no attempt to ground itself in a setting beyond the immediacy of the creepy school concept. It's that thing I mentioned about Space World. This feels more like a fleeting, ethereal dream because it's so isolated and contextually barren. As is the case with every secret world except Underwater World, finishing this one is not a replacement for doing the main world. Instead, it plops the player back into the main world alongside some changes. In this case, it seems to skip forward in time by many years, judging by the absence of Grady, change the color palette and intensity of the fog, replaces the well entrance to School World with a note that turns the screen red for a moment. And locks the mansion door so the player has to backtrack briefly to find that most of the path has been replaced by a cliff, I wouldn't be surprised if a good portion of players went through School World on their first go, given that it has 2 entrances which are sitting barely off the main path. Though maybe others weren't as willing to throw themselves into pits to check things out as I was. I don't know. As a final note on School World here, I noticed during it the curious detail that the HUD indicator for the dreamer's movement state just stops showing up partway through the game. I figured at the time that it was just to better accommodate the atmosphere of that stage, and then it was also gone in the rest of the main worlds, so never mind. It's demonstrably not a bug either, as it fades out during the post-black hole walking segment as the dreamer, and only returns in Candy World, which is a prequel to Haunted World. Haunted World truly begins when the player enters the mansion, greeting them with a wide hall and the Ghost King sitting upon his throne. Speaking to him reveals that his heart is locked in the cellar, separated from his body. He requests that the player retrieve it for him. This world also heavily uses the environmental change gimmick found in School World, however I think it's used to better effect here. The 2 games I mentioned as potentially desensitizing me to this mechanic are also great examples of its 2 relevant applications to Boundless Dreams. In Where Am I, it's largely used to disorient the player, induce feelings that they're lost and aimless, and frighten them about the nature of the space they inhabit. For that last point, it's crucial that there's no consistency at all to the pathways taken. Any one of them can remain or close at any moment, which makes navigation completely inexplicable and thus unsettling. In Antechamber, it's used for a more exploratory purpose, offering a way to construct and navigate a map which is novel from static, consistent space. It bolsters exploration and discovery. School World seems to go more for Where Am I's approach, though not as effectively since many components of the space remain fixed. It feels more as though you're being funneled through a specific path than having your sense of direction and place fucked with. Haunted World opts more so for the Antechamber approach, using it to enhance the atmosphere and tepid discovery that a horror-y setting provides. Haunted World is a bit of a mishmash of various different horror media, which I say relying solely on its entry in the Dream Hub due to my limited exposure to said media, so the spooky mansion setting should feel rather familiar in many ways. For me, the closest related thing I have personal experience with is Awoni, which I'm likely reminded of largely because of the piano puzzle shortly into the level. But it clearly has some other tropes and such from elsewhere, even if I'm presumably blind to most of them. Ultimately, I think I prefer the approach Haunted World takes to a darker tone because I perhaps inadvertently find solace in the tropes presented. It's still atmospheric and unnerving, but not in the way that School World actively is. It's a little more passive, a thematically consistent break from the school's intensity without necessarily foregoing a semi-frightening space. However, it has a story to it which is very much in line with Ice World and Underwater World. Namely that it's just kinda tragic and sad. That's mostly covered in Candy World, which I won't be talking about in this video, so unfortunately this will remain unexplained here, but I don't have many thoughts on that level, so it doesn't feel worth bringing up. Either way, that additional upsetting element slightly eclipses my preference for Haunted World's take on horror, and thus I end up liking School World more overall. After some stuff for which I don't really have any comments, the player returns the Ghost King's heart and he offers his dream shard in return. That marks the end of Haunted World, the final main level which I can more or less straightforwardly say I liked. Or, well, I can say I like it now, but actually on my first playthrough it was a disappointing precedent for things to come. School World was one thing as a secret, but to see a main world go this route was a bad sign for my hopes for Boundless Dreams. Haunted World also contains a short story strewn about the mansion in 5 parts. It's titled The Rapture of Grimthorn, and that's actually the only instance outside of developer commentary where her name is ever given. I hope I'm not mistaken about that. I'm sorry if that's just incorrect. Anyway, the story itself doesn't seem to add anything whatsoever to the game's overall narrative. I can see 2 purposes to it. First is just informing the player a little more of Grimthorn's existence, and perhaps serving as a bit more foreshadowing for the whole Hypno situation, since it depicts Goji, identifiable through his bell, using his light magic to defeat the dark nightmare creature. By extension, it also gives some precedent for the ending cutscene. The second is that it displays explicitly that individual dreams can now be directly altered in a precise way by a nightmare being from the broader dreamscape. That hasn't happened before. Returning to the Dream Nexus shows Grimthorn once again perched on a faraway pillar, which happened just before Iceworld as well, and the music has gone creepypasta mode. I'll return to this. The next level is Infinite Shopping, but I'm gonna refer to it as Gateway to Heaven based on this spinning globe. In its developer commentary, it's mentioned that Gateway to Heaven, alongside Haunted World, took the longest to plan out for their layout and flow. This worked out wonderfully for Haunted World, as that level has some of the least backtracking out of any thus far and is very eventful. It's clear that it had a lot of effort put into it. Gateway to Heaven, on the other hoof, it would be easy for a player to assume otherwise, that the stage is lazy because of the heavy amount of backtracking within it and the absence of much mechanical or environmental variety. I think it sort of disrespects the developer to not subject that feeling to scrutiny. I'm all for criticizing Boundless Dreams, or any piece of art, but it has to be measured and empathetic. Art is made by people, and it's extremely important to keep those people in mind, regardless of whether or not you know them on a personal level or have even seen them. I know nothing about the main guy who made this game, nothing about their skills, and nothing about their goals for Hypnagogia beyond what they divulged in the game itself. Did I feel that the level was monotonous while playing it? Absolutely. I got a tad bored running around in all the same places. But to uncritically accept that as a problem with the game and then offer it as critique is, to me, inconsiderate without caveat. It's okay to make that claim at all. I don't agree with it anymore, but I once felt that turning this escalator around would benefit Gateway to Heaven's pacing. But I think it should be done with an understanding that the developer likely did it this way for a reason, for the specific emotional experience that this can provide as opposed to a more brisk or varied play space. Some may feel that such a thing is implied in giving feedback in the first place, but even still, I believe it's important to attempt to remain level-headed and reasonable in your points and the conveyance thereof. Gateway to Heaven is all about finding a kid and delivering a couple things to them to comfort them. During this process, a few things change in the mall. First, it's just a couple gates opening, but then things look worn down, abandoned. The banners are torn up, the gateway globe stops rotating, there's a murky liquid flooding certain spots. Some of the shops are boarded up and vacant. There's rust, some writhing meat blobs, fences. It's really not doing great. So, the player returns the kid's pretzel, and the game does something that I'd normally find trite. Then the mall turns into this brutalist hellscape, I hope I'm not misusing that, for one final trek back to the plaza. In this case, I'm actually fine with it. The reason why has to do with all these sleep paralysis demons. It could very much be read as the corruption of the dreamscape manifesting through this piece of dialogue, signaling to the player that their time has come, likely an attempt to dissuade them from further pursuing the dream shards, or to convince them that they've already lost so there's no point to continue. It could also be Grimthorn in particular who's butting in to offer that message. It doesn't make much of a difference. Either way, it's a more directed and intense version of the Rapture of Grimthorn situation, in some sense. Anyway, I think the end of Gateway to Heaven is worth displaying without me blabbering over it. Okay, sorry, I edited that. It actually has another Dream Nexus section in between these levels. But I did that to demonstrate a point. These levels have a clear point of connection, a physical transition from one to the next for two levels which feel like one. Just before entering Tower of Heaven, Grimthorn stops the player to muse a bit about the difficulties to come. She states, quote, "You will be told lies and untruths from lesser beings who only wish to take control of the dreamscape themselves. To listen would be foolish, unquote. This line has stuck out to me as kind of bizarre because there's no clear resolution or target for these words. Obviously, it's hypocritical of Grimthorn to say this, as she's trying to do exactly that, but I don't get the impression that this was written solely as another bit of foreshadowing. And if that really is it, why would she say this? Nobody after her tries to lie. Or we'll see about that. But if nothing else, I don't see any reason that she would truly believe this or feel any compulsion whatsoever to say it, even if she's right. Is it merely a final, pathetic attempt to sow doubt about her being untrustworthy? I don't see it that way. Regardless, she continues, quote, "Face your true self in these final moments," unquote. I'll come back to this later too, along with the perched Grimthorn thing. I think it's important to point them out as they happen, but we don't yet have the knowledge required for me to discuss them. Tower of Heaven begins in this sewer thing, dark and dingy. The title of the level popping up suggested to me a juxtaposition. Heaven is obviously something typically thought of as positive, gorgeous, untainted. Yet here's some text-colored red, the spooky color of all things, telling me that this shithole is related to some sort of heaven. Strange. The player then slides down onto a platform amidst a dead sea of decayed dreams, with a lot of pillars dotted around which look decidedly similar to those in the Dream Nexus. They meet with this little guy who vaguely gestures towards a concept that I genuinely don't know how you're supposed to understand without reading their entry in the model showcase. Basically, these were goobers who went to sleep at one point, never woke up, slowly became one with the dreams they were caught up in, then became little freaks when the dream crystal shattered and corrupted everything. Key here is that the rejected are explicitly general. They have arrived in whatever this dimension is from elsewhere. Unrelated people and places have fallen away to end up in the Tower of Heaven. Along with these fragments of dreams that the player has been to previously, I don't think Tower of Heaven is a dream world in the same way that all the other levels are. There's a lot of talk in here of this being a dumping ground of sorts for the dreamscape. The dreamscape itself obviously isn't supposed to be real life, it's a dream after all, but in the text it's presented as some sort of tangible world. Within the dreamscape, or perhaps beside it, are individual dreams, which seem to have their own continuous timelines that run parallel to each other. The Dream Nexus, Nowhere, and, if I'm wrong about my theory about it earlier, the Ethereal Crux seem to be metadimensions in a sense, on top of the tangible worlds of the dreams themselves. They're separate and all-encompassing, able to freely include elements of the dreams because while those are self-contained, the meta-realms are not. For Tower of Heaven to have people and things from other dreams in the ways that it does only makes sense to me if it is itself a metadimension. I think Gateway to Heaven is an isolated dream which has been appropriated and corrupted by the sleep paralysis demons in order to toy with the player and direct them into the Tower of Heaven. As such, whether intentional or not, I view this second instance of Grimthorn's perching as indicating the same thing as the first. Something about the nature of the world you're visiting has changed since your last venture. She was there as Iceworld introduced darker themes to the main dreams, and she was there as Gateway to Heaven began the end. Quick note, earlier I said something about Goji being in a dream in the Ethereal Crux. What I meant was an individual dream of sorts, as opposed to a meta-realm, but I wasn't going to pull that terminology out at the time, so I simplified it. Hopefully people knew what I meant anyway, despite the entire game taking place within the dreamscape, making it a silly statement when taken literally. I have little to say on the dialogue within the bulk of Tower of Heaven, but holy shit, what a phenomenal climactic energy it has. Look at this environment, listen to this music. The way that the vignette filter over the screen interacts with the color compression and fog is brilliant. It induces this claustrophobic, desperate feeling by hindering the clarity of the player's vision. The desolation conveyed through the textures, deathly water, the NPCs and their poses and animations, it's incredibly vivid. The level is super grandiose compared to previous ones as well. The open ocean and climb up the massive towers are, for the lack of a better word, epic. And it feels so aesthetically connected to Gateway to Heaven to me. The two are effectively inseparable in my mind for reasons that I've evidently had trouble identifying or putting into words. That said, Gateway to Heaven and Tower of Heaven are inherently dreadful to inhabit. Everything about their tone and context, they're just as bad as Iceworld for different reasons. So even though I do genuinely like them a lot and in many ways, and appreciate their artistry, I just can't deal with them. I hate them. At the end of Tower of Heaven, the player meets the Dreamcatcher proper. That's the glob of bloom from earlier. When asked what they are, the Dreamcatcher responds that they are a passive observer, and that everything that has happened here is part of a sequence predetermined by their will alone. This single line is enough to discredit the thing entirely, not because I believe they don't have any power in the world, they've demonstrated that they do, but because they just admitted to being complicit in causing tons of suffering in the realm they preside over for longer than the player can imagine, and for what? Why would someone who has the power to prevent mass suffering for presumably countless years just decide to sit and do nothing? This is why I gave a caveat to Grimthorn's line about lesser beings trying to lie to the player. I don't think that she had any reason to believe that that were the case, or at least no reason I can ascertain. But fuck the Dreamcatcher, I absolutely think that this motherfucker is fundamentally dishonest. They're clearly indifferent to the well-being of people in the dreamscape, and their claim to be a passive observer who never interferes with the events of the game beyond preventing the dreamer's death is literally just incorrect. They pulled the dreamer out of a black hole and handed them the dream shard that they failed to collect themselves, and they do it again at the end of Tower of Heaven. Their model showcase description literally says they refuse to interfere with the dreams, except for all the ways that they interfere with dreams. Buddy. After what feels like it's trying to invoke the imagery of a nuclear bomb, the player is warped to some kind of heaven-esque space that's rather reminiscent of the tutorial. An unexplained and unlabeled being greets the player and suggests that the two should proceed together. I can read this in two ways. First is that this is a manifestation of the dreamer's consciousness speaking to them in a way that seems external, but given the nature of this place, it's not supposed to be a literal copy or anything. Second is that this is the real dreamer who the player inhabited up until the Ethereal Crux with Goji. I initially took it as the first, but I'm more partial to the latter as of now. I see no other reason why the developer would remove the dreamer's HUD icons, and both the mirror in the Ethereal Crux and Hypno talk about having a true self. That reads like a clear and direct hint at this very thing. The dreamer, or the player, is finally meeting their true self. Anyway, the player then has representations of characters from each main world describe how the dreamer has helped them in some way. Initially, I was very skeptical about this section, feeling as though the quotes from these characters were significantly mismatched, but after rereading them and referencing prior dialogue, no, they fit fine enough. I had this big conspiracy theory about the Dreamcatcher probably fabricating this whole section to reassure the dreamer or something, but nah, that reading just doesn't add up. That's okay. The Dreamcatcher is still some centrist fuckhead who prefers mass preventable suffering over taking a goddamn stance on anything. Wouldn't be surprised if they created the Tower of Heaven too in some capacity, thus being responsible for dumping a bunch of decaying people into the ocean. For how wonderfully Gateway to Heaven and Tower of Heaven build to a climax, I found the ending cutscene disappointing. Just after collecting the final dream shard, the dreamer returns to the dream nexus. Grimthorn goes to do her evil villain plan and take over the dreamscape, and then Goji pops out of the newly repaired dream crystal. Grimthorn reveals her true form and throws Mimic Goji off the dream crystal's platform for not doing quite what she wanted. Grimthorn's motivation here of bringing balance to the dreamscape feels like a farce. It comes across as generic, I do bad things because I'm evil kind of stuff. It plays this whole thing straight, so much so that it feels completely devoid of anything to analyze, which is a shame because I think the Dreamcatcher and Ethereal Crux and the simple disappearance of a HUD element accommodate a good bit of theorizing, as I've demonstrated. Despite disliking the ending, though, the earnestness of its presentation is charming, and I'm sure the developer and probably a bunch of players liked it a lot. And that's okay. I'm allowed to find something that others like uninteresting, and neither of us have to get all upset about it. I find myself with a lingering resentment for the Dreamcatcher that I struggle to substantiate. I think what I said is accurate, that they caused needless torment and hid behind their self-imposed vow of inaction to justify it, as if that's some fundamental fact of the universe rather than a choice, yet they can't even hold themselves to it. Issue is, I have little to point to as evidence, only unverifiable hunches. The only other evidence I have for my feelings is that the Dreamcatcher probably has something to do with the weird true dreamer situation, given that the black hole scene seems to depict the Dreamcatcher speaking to the dreamer. I'm completely uncertain what that actually means for the narrative itself, but that it happened at all and seems to have been caused by the Dreamcatcher is some passable, unreliable circumstantial evidence to justify my perspective on them. The Tower of Heaven reads to me as something not wholly disconnected from the Dreamcatcher's influence, and in fact, I think the Tower of Heaven is indicative of their wishes for the world. In quite so dire a way? Perhaps not, but to some degree, yes, I do think so. Calling it Tower of Heaven as opposed to Tower to Heaven is appropriate. This is heaven. There are just more idyllic parts of it reserved for those deemed more worthy. The whole sequence for getting the Dream Shard feels fabricated by them as well. I still can't fully trust it, even if the dialogue more or less holds up to scrutiny. The fact that a massive explosion of light sends the player there just after speaking to the Dreamcatcher seems apt as well. This is not a productive way to cap off the journey. They blow everything the fuck up and teleport the player to their goal. That explosion isn't necessarily related to the Dreamcatcher at all, but it feels like it is, so I distrust them more. I can't take their alleged virtue as anything but a falsehood, and I don't think that's the intent. I don't believe the same of Goji, although Goji barely did anything except kill Grimthorn and die at the end, so I barely have an impression of him in the first place. To be clear, this is not me criticizing the writing of the Dreamcatcher. This is me presenting a reading I have of the character, while acknowledging that I have a little more than a nebulous impression informed by like 2 lines of dialogue to pin this reading on. I'm criticizing the Dreamcatcher's actions as a character. I actually find this whole thing interesting to consider. I just have my doubts that this is at all intentional. I don't have a conclusion for the narrative of the game because my main impressions of the characters involved are non-existent for Goji, broadly textually unsupported for the Dreamcatcher, and there's almost nothing to read into for Grimthorn's motives. Mimic Goji washes ashore on an inexplicable island full of dream crystals, and for some reason, being tossed into the void by the main villain of the game made it turn evil. You would think that would prompt it to do the opposite, since its one connection on that side, so to speak, had done something pretty horrid to it. Its model showcase entry states that it wasn't evil until this happened, so that isn't just how it was from the beginning. It's also called an idiot though, so maybe that's the justification. I don't know if there's a sequel to this game coming, or perhaps already released, so who knows if this scene will lead to anything. So, Hypnagogia, Boundless Dreams. This game has almost holistically interrupted my normal thought processes and upended much of the scarce comfort and feelings of normalcy I cling on to yet. Fittingly, it's as though my brain was infected with the fucking thing. All thought came back to Hypnagogia, Boundless Dreams sooner or later. This has been a hopefully short-lived obsession spurred on by isolation and emotional impact I was woefully unprepared for, and I cannot wait until I go back to thinking about and doing my usual things. I'll still be insecure, manic, depressed, hopeless, but I will have escaped hypnagogia. I could not find a way to naturally work this into the end here, but I want to mention it, so I'll note it on its own. If I'm honest, the feelings of guilt and sorrow that I got from Underwater World and Ice and Desert World have ever so slightly further convinced me that I'm not the emotionally callous shithead I sometimes worry I am. It would have been exceedingly easy to excuse my lack of care by distancing myself from those actions and situations because it's a video game. But I didn't. And perhaps that says something. The sheer breadth of feelings Hypnagogia elicited from me is unprecedented, and I struggle to reconcile its disparate parts as being of the same game. Mistworld is somehow part of the same whole as Gateway to Heaven and Tower of Heaven, which are somehow part of the same whole as Underwater World, which is somehow part of the same whole as School World. It doesn't feel incoherent or haphazard, despite its fairly short runtime. All of this manages to coalesce into a whole that is solid and complete. Out of everything I've ever engaged with, relatively short as that list is, I think Hypnagogia may have been the most emotionally evocative piece of art I've ever experienced. I respect it a ton for that, and I hope I've conveyed that perspective through this video. Maybe, though, instead of promising myself that I'd go into it blind, it would have been best for me to have continued watching Simple Flips play it back in 2021.